A Murder Over Mars. Did Johannes Kepler poison Tycho Brahe? I'm going to recite an article I did on this question, as well as make some additional comments, clarify some things that are not clear in the original article. And this is a video that's being produced on December 31st, 2019, New Year's Eve. So on October 13th, 1601, that's over 400 years ago, the famous astronomer and astrologer Tycho Brahe, who lived from 1546 to 1601, the new friend, confidant, and advisor to the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II, one of the most powerful men in Europe, became unexpectedly and gravely ill at a banquet in the imperial capital of Prague. Tycho was a colorful, athletic, and brilliant Danish nobleman who had defied convention by taking a commoner as his wife, and by pursuing the study of astronomy instead of the more common pastimes of his fellow nobles in Denmark, which he pointedly disdained as frivolous and unimportant. Now, this is a picture of Tycho Brahe from about that time. Tycho suffered horribly for about a week, seemed to begin recovering, and then died unexpectedly on October 24th, 1601. Tycho was knighted for his good health and vigor. His death came as a surprise to his family, friends, and colleagues. Now here I'm going to say a little bit more. The imperial court was a hotbed of intrigue and filled with peculiar and often ambitious men who frequently worked with highly toxic chemicals, astrologers, alchemists, and magicians in the employ of the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II, who lived from 1552 to 1612. Rudolf II hoped to unlock the secrets of the universe by funding a research program that might be called the Manhattan Project of its time. So something that's not always clear and is often glossed over in accounts of this in books about science and astronomy and so forth, is these people believed in and were really trying to practice things like magic and alchemy, sorcery, all kinds of stuff that we don't associate with mathematics or astronomy today. So in this time, things like mathematics and astronomy really refer to astrology and magical practices. And these are things that Kepler believed in, Tycho Brahe believed in, Rudolf II, who very likely had a mental illness, believed in. So that's important to understand the context in which these people lived. And these people worked with, as I said, highly toxic chemicals, often compounds of mercury, that were used in alchemy and in other kinds of magical operations. So from the start, there were rumors that Tycho had been poisoned, and some suspected his assistant, the young, equally brilliant mathematician and astronomer Johannes Kepler, remembered today as the author of Kepler's 3 laws of planetary motion. Tycho was buried with great pomp and circumstance in Prague on November 4th, 1601, with some of his friends and colleagues making pointed aspersions in Kepler's direction during the ceremonies. In time, his beloved wife, Kirsten Barbara Jorgensdatter, was buried beside him. So Tycho and Kepler. So Tycho was much older than Kepler, which is perhaps part of the story and part of the reason they didn't get along so well. By 1 year earlier, in 1600, Tycho had accumulated over a lifetime by far the most accurate measurements of the positions of the planets over time, especially the planet Mars, thought by astrologers and kings to influence the occurrence and outcomes of wars and conflict. After years of lavish royal patronage in Denmark, his home country, Tycho had a falling out with the new king and fled to the mostly German-speaking Holy Roman Empire of Rudolf II. Here, with funding from Rudolf II, he hoped to analyze his data and confirm his own novel theory of the solar system, the known universe of the time, in which the Earth was the center, with the sun and moon orbiting the Earth and all the other planets orbiting the sun. Tycho hired the brilliant young up-and-coming astronomer and mathematician Johannes Kepler, who lived from 1571 to 1630, to analyze his data. Kepler hoped to use Tycho's data to confirm his own theory of everything based on the hot new sun-centered theory of Nicolaus Copernicus, who lived from 1473 to 1543. So Copernicus's theory had been published after his death, and it was completely sun-centered. Everything moved around the sun, and Kepler was an adherent to this idea and believed that he found a mathematical formula based on the Platonic solids that helped explain the orbits in the heliocentric Copernicus system. That actually turned out to be wrong, and that's one of Kepler's great discoveries. So this is a painting of Kepler from 1610, several years after Tycho Brahe passed away. They had a stormy working relationship until Tycho's untimely death in 1601, which left Kepler, perhaps conveniently, with the access to Tycho's data that he desired. In the chaos accompanying Tycho's death, Kepler quietly walked off with Brahe's notebooks containing his data on Mars. So these were precise measurements of the angles, the positions of Mars on given dates over the years. And these have been made both in Denmark and with special, very high precision instruments, sextants, in Prague. Now, this is just shortly before telescopes come into widespread use in astronomy. The ensuing controversy with Brahe's family was eventually resolved more or less amicably, but in the meantime, Kepler had the data he sought. In one of the great ironies of scientific history, Kepler proceeded to discover that his pet theory, the other variants of Copernicus' sun-centered system, the traditional Earth-centered system of Claudius Ptolemy, and Tycho's hybrid Earth-Sun-centered system were all wrong, although he was never able to fully accept that the data ruled out his system as well. What did he find? The models were all mathematically equivalent, although they had different physical interpretations. All incorrectly assumed that the motions of Mars and the other planets were built up from uniform circular motion, the infamous epicycles. Kepler's analysis of Tycho's data on the planet Mars took about 5 years, including his work in 1600 and 1601 when he had limited access to the full dataset. In 1605, while taking a break during the Easter holiday, Kepler had his eureka moment. He realized that the orbit of Mars was elliptical, with the Sun at one focus of the ellipse, and the speed of the planet varied inversely with the distance from the Sun, so that the planet swept out the same area in the same time, traveling faster the closer the planet was to the Sun. These two insights are now known as Kepler's first and second laws, and they ensured the fame of both Brahe and Kepler to the present day. Did Kepler murder Tycho? This has been speculated from the very beginning. In 1991, soon after the end of the Cold War, the National Museum in Prague gave a somewhat peculiar goodwill gift to Denmark, a small box with a 6-centimeter long sample of Tycho Brahe's mustache hair, acquired years earlier when Tycho's crypt was refurbished in 1901. Tycho and his wife's skeletons were examined and then reburied in 1901, but a few samples were taken and given to the National Museum in Prague. The gift reopened the old question of whether Kepler or someone else had poisoned Tycho in 1601. Kepler had been a seemingly deeply religious man who had given up a comfortable teaching job in Graz rather than abandon his Lutheran faith and convert to Catholicism. He was later excommunicated from the Lutheran Church for publicly rejecting the Lutheran doctrine of ubiquity, with no apparent gain to himself. This latter doctrine was an esoteric theological issue, nonetheless of paramount importance in the conflict between the Lutherans, Calvinists, and Catholics that would soon lead to the horrific 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648. This same stubbornness in holding to his views, and perhaps the jealousy of his colleagues, had led Kepler into bitter clashes with Tycho and others during his career. Could such a man have committed murder for the lucrative position of imperial mathematician in Rudolf II's court, for fame, or even a fanatical desire to extend human knowledge, whatever the cost? The hair from Tycho's mustache was examined using modern forensic techniques by Bent Kempe, director of the Department of Forensic Chemistry at the Institute of Forensic Medicine at the University of Copenhagen, one of the leading toxicologists in Europe, and potentially lethal levels of mercury detected. Kempe concluded that Tycho Brahe's uremia, so he became unable to urinate, which eventually killed him. Tycho Brahe's uremia can probably be traced to mercury poisoning, most likely to Brahe's experiments with his elixir 11 to 12 days before his death. So what this is referring to is that Tycho was taking an elixir which contained a mercury compound for his health, and that so basically he ended up killing himself according to this theory. So it's important to understand that mercury compounds and mercury, in addition to being toxic, were also believed at that time to have healthy effects. And so Tycho Brahe was giving himself low doses of a mercury compound. Some experts argued the mercury measurements demonstrated that Tycho had been poisoned and murdered with a mercury compound. Others suggested that the mercury was due to the embalming process or some other contamination of Tycho's remains. So contamination is a common problem and issue in a lot of forensic techniques, and it's poorly understood. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later. So in 2004, Joshua Gilder and his wife Anne Lee Gilder published a book called Heavenly Intrigue: Johannes Kepler, Tycho Brahe, and the Murder Behind One of History's Greatest Scientific Discoveries. So this is the book on Amazon, and this book argues that Kepler murdered Tycho Brahe using a mercury compound of some sort, or even raw mercury. Now again, these people were all involved in alchemy, and they were working with mercury, the silvery liquid, and also with all sorts of mercury compounds, like cinnabar, for example, which is a sulfur mercury compound. They didn't really understand what all these things were the way we do today, and they believed incorrectly, in fact, in a sort of complicated alchemical theories in which sulfur and mercury were sort of fundamental elements, although that's even not really quite accurate way of describing the alchemical theories. But in practice, they often worked with what we now realize were compounds of mercury, as well as mercury itself. So this controversy, this book got a fair amount of attention, and it led to the exhumation of Tycho's skeleton in 2010 in an attempt to settle the issue. And the analysis of Tycho's remains in 2010, actually it's 2012, but the analysis of his remains seemingly ruled out lethal levels of mercury as the cause of death in 2012, and seems to have been generally consistent with natural causes, a bladder infection. So at this point, I'm going to talk a little bit about how likely it is that Tycho Brahe might have died of natural causes, and it is perfectly reasonable that he may have, and also a bit about this environment and the kinds of people that were floating around Rudolf II in a little bit more detail. So let's go here. These are actuarial tables from the United States Social Security Administration in 2016, and what they show is your annual risk of dying. So we're going to consider men because Tycho Brahe was a man. This is your age, and this is your probability of dying. So when you're a child, it's very, very low. So your probability in their first year of dying is 0.0004. So it's less than 1/100% chance of dying. And now this is today in 2016. Mortality rates were much higher in Tycho Brahe's time. So let's take a look at Tycho Brahe's age. Tycho Brahe was 54 when he passed away, and he actually, today, if he lived today in the United States in 2016, he would in fact have faced a 0.007 or a 0.7% chance in that year of dying, so almost 1%. Now keep in mind that maybe not quite right way to think about it. In his 50s, from 50 to say 59, if you accumulate all these together, you're looking at probably over a 5% chance that an adult man will die sometime in his 50s. And that's today. Our medicine is better. People live longer. The likelihood of your dying in your 50s is almost certainly much lower today than it was in Tycho Brahe's time. So it's not that far-fetched that he came down with something natural. It was not poisoned, and that's how he died. And just to give some graphics, this is similar data. It's very similar numbers from the United Kingdom, Britain in 2003. Very similar numbers. So here you can see your risks. So what happens is as we get older, our risk of dying each year goes up and up and up until, of course, when you're very old, at least for the vast majority of human beings, we are approaching the point where we will die for sure. You know, very few people live over maybe 100 years of age, 105 years of age. So Tycho Brahe would have been somewhere in about here, facing a bit less than a 1 in 100%, a 1 in 100 chance each year of dying in his 50s. And that assumes today's medicine. and today's health conditions, which probably the situation in Prague was worse. They didn't have water treatment systems like we have today. We take for granted that almost everybody has. You don't have to be a king or a nobleman to have it, but the nobility didn't have these kinds of things in general. Food was contaminated. Many other risks were much higher um, in those days than they are today. So it's not at all far-fetched that he had naturally occurring uremia, that his death was perfectly natural. Now, on the other hand, it's worth understanding that Rudolf II was kind of kooky, and he was really financing research into sort of dark stuff, alchemy and other things that were very questionable at that time. Um, he was suspected of practicing black magic, and he surrounded himself with these kind of dubious people who were involved in this sort of thing, including perhaps Kepler. So one of the many oddities of Kepler's life is that his mother, at about this time, was accused of being a witch in league with the devil and poisoning some of her neighbors. And Kepler defended her, of course, as a son probably should, or at least we would think. So this is actually a book about Kepler and his mother and this case. Now, it is alleged that Rudolf II had acquired a copy of the Picatrix. So this was a banned book of magic, which was very, not controversial, but very feared. It was banned by the Catholic Church, and it was believed to be extremely evil, even though if you read it, it's not so clear what it is. But there's a point here. This is a modern English translation of the Picatrix, and they emphasize these following points in the introduction as a warning to any modern people experimenting with it. Some of the recipes in this book produce lethal poisons. Not all of them are listed as such. In fact, some of them are described as healthful cures, and some of the things that are listed as lethal poisons would be harmless if ingested. Now, the medieval student of Picatrix, if he followed the advice concerning preparatory studies, would have already had a good working knowledge of the herbs and minerals that made up the stock and trade of the medieval physician, and thus would have known at a glance that a recipe contained large doses of bitter almond oil, even though it was labeled as a cure, would quickly kill the person who took it. Most modern occultists do not have that background. In emphasis, it is therefore urgently necessary, if you choose to put any of the following teachings into practice, to do the necessary research yourself and be sure that you know the health and safety issues surrounding every ingredient. So think about that. Someone, either through ignorance or malice, cooked up a book which contains lethal poisons being presented as, for example, cures for diseases. And that's apparently some of the stuff in the Picatrix. So this may very well be part of the reason for its sinister reputation. It's particularly notorious in the history of magic as extremely dangerous, and perhaps the work of the devil or something like that. And Rudolf II was sort of fiddling around with this kind of stuff. So it's, for this reason, not quite as far-fetched as you might think that someone, whether it was Kepler or some other person floating around in the someone else floating around in the royal court in Prague at that time, and Rudolf II was funding all sorts of these weird, magicians and alchemists and other kind of shady people, that someone might in fact have poisoned Tycho for whatever reasons. But at present, it's fair to say that the weight of our evidence is that he probably died of natural causes. So this kind of brings us into the question of the limits of forensic science, and that's not directly related to Kepler, but the point, of course, is that we initially have what we now think is a false positive, where they find mercury in his mustache or something like that. And of course, this could come from some type of contamination. Mercury and mercury compounds were all over the place. Tycho had them. He was actually taking an elixir that contained a certain amount of mercury. He had an alchemical laboratory and that sort of thing that he was involved in, as did many other people involved in the royal court with Rudolf II. So forensic results are often presented as very accurate and reliable, but over the last few years there are many cases, and this is an example of an article that goes into some specific cases as well as some general problems that have been found with a lot of modern forensic analysis. So this is not like forensic analysis in the 1600s. This is the kind of stuff you see on television today, and it's sometimes been portrayed as very accurate. Bite analysis, hair matching at crime scenes. A lot of these have been used in famous criminal cases and have been largely discredited the last couple of years. And significant problems have surfaced with not DNA, sorry, with fingerprint analysis, for example, and also with DNA. So you'll often hear these 1 in a trillion probabilities spouted for DNA, but those 1 in a trillion matching probabilities do not incorporate a statistical model of contamination. That is, scenarios where the DNA somehow got onto a sample erroneously. Your DNA may very well be in a neighbor's house or apartment, which you have never been in, simply because we shed skin, hair, blood, these kind of things. And the modern tests for DNA are super sensitive, so your DNA can end up somewhere that you yourself have never been and perhaps would be very surprised that the DNA got there. And we don't have good models of this. And the probabilities quoted to juries today do not incorporate those probabilities. They just say, assuming they just use models of the frequency of these genetic markers without considering contamination. And contamination, going back to Kepler and Tycho Brahe, is a very important question here. How did the mercury get onto his mustache and so forth? That it could have happened before he was buried in the embalming process. It could have happened somehow inside the grave. The body was, or the skeleton was taken out of the grave in 1901. Maybe the laboratory in Denmark, or not Denmark, wherever it was. I'm trying to remember. It might have been Denmark. Copenhagen, yeah. So the laboratory in Denmark that did the test could have screwed something up. There are a lot of different possibilities. So that's something to think about when you see forensic evidence presented, in whether it's in history issues like here or in criminal court cases. So the final conclusion of this article and discussion is that it is possible that Tycho Brahe was murdered by someone, and Kepler is a reasonable candidate. He benefited from Brahe's death. There were many people floating around in Prague associated with Rudolf II and Tycho Brahe and Kepler, who were kind of shady characters. So it's very possible that there could have been a murder. On the other hand, the weight of evidence that we currently have is that Tycho Brahe probably died of natural causes. And as I mentioned from actuarial tables and so forth, it's not that unusual at all. He faced a several percent chance of dying in his 50s just from natural causes. This concludes this video.